Yes, when you unmute it, it works better. Thank you. My name is Emily Mead, and I am not our IT director. I am our Chief Philanthropy Officer for the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the museum. We're delighted to have here tonight's program, which will explore activist journalism on the Portuguese Revolution. This evening is part of our Portuguese and Lusophone-World lecture series, which is an annual program of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. This event is underwritten by the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies at Brown University, with support from the Azorian Maritime Heritage Society, FLAD, the Luso-American Foundation of Lisbon, the William M. Wood Foundation. And this program is also made possible by additional support from our sponsors, Bay Coast Bank, Ben Saud Hotels, and our media partners, WJFD. So thank you, Henry and Paulina. Where are you? Let's see, Paulina and Henry. They're here, okay. Individual support is also provided by Onesimo Almeida, Patricia and Armin Fernandez, Will and Anita Mendonca, and Gil Perry and Donna Sachs. So thanks to all for making the program possible. And finally, I want to thank all of you who are museum members, because you sustain everything that we do. Thanks to you, in 2025, the museum is seeing record high visitation levels. We're 15% ahead of last year, which was our prior record. So great momentum and support for the museum. And nearly 80,000 visitors have come through our doors. An additional 50,000 have visited New Bedford through one of our 3 traveling exhibitions, one of which is Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad, which is based on a book by and co-curated by Tim Walker, who's of course our featured speaker tonight, one of our 2 featured speakers. So if you're not yet a member, please do sign up tonight. You'll receive a free admission for 12 months and 50% off ticketed events like tonight's program, as well as being invited to our members' holiday party on December 7th. So you can find more info on whalingmuseum.org. And so it is now my pleasure to get the program begun, to introduce Daniela Melo, who is a political scientist and lecturer in social sciences at Boston University, and Timothy Walker, a professor of history at UMass Dartmouth, where he serves on the executive board of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture and is graduate faculty of the Department of Portuguese. So please join me in welcoming them.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here and to see so many friends in the audience tonight. Thank you all so much for coming out. We're really very, very grateful for that. The way this is going to break down tonight, I'm going to begin, and I'll tell you a little bit about the author of the book that Daniela and I had the great pleasure and the honor of sort of resuscitating and bringing back into public awareness after a long time of not being in public awareness. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we managed the project of finding this book and bringing it back. And then, after I'm done with that bit, Daniela will come in and give you a sense of the importance of this book as an important insight and a window into the Portuguese Revolution in 1974 and 75. So we have a 2-part program, and we will tag team, and I'm happy to get started. Thank you all for coming. This is great. So this is Wilfred Burchett, and this is how he appeared in the late 60s before the Portuguese Revolution. And our talk tonight, we talk about reviving Wilfred Burchett's activist journalism and how he came to be interested in the Portuguese Revolution. Now, if you're like me and Daniela, you might not know Wilfred Burchett or his work very well. We certainly didn't. Back in 2011, when we first encountered his books, Daniela was on her Fulbright year in Lisbon, and I had gone over to join her, and we were browsing, as one does, in old bookshops, alfa revistas, these antiquarian bookshops that you can find in Lisbon. And we were very near the Cervejaria Trindade in Largo de Trindade Coelho in central Lisbon, right in the Bairro Alto. And we were in this classic old bookstore that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But we were browsing through books, and we came across this book, the one on the left, which has the red cover, and it was called Portugal depois da Revolução dos Capitães, Portugal after the Revolution of the Captains. And I was looking at it, and it had a name on the cover that was clearly not a Portuguese name, and neither Daniela nor myself were familiar with this book. But we started leafing through it, and we realized it was really interesting. And so we asked the owner of the bookshop about it, and it turned out there was a second book, the green cover book, that had been a follow-up, a kind of a sequel to the first book. Now, the first book had been published in 1975 by Wilfred Burchett, who was an Australian journalist, we discovered, and he did it after reporting on the street, on the scene in Portugal shortly after the beginning of the Portuguese Revolution. Well, neither Daniela nor I knew much about this guy, so we bought copies of these books and we took them home and we started reading through them, and we really began to see that they were really important publications about the Portuguese Revolution. They offered insights that we had never seen anywhere else, and so we decided we really needed to know more about Wilfred Burchett. So the first book, the red cover one, had been published in an edition of 20,000 volumes, and it had been a top seller in Portugal in the mid-1970s. It was a really well-known book 50 years ago, but it had since fallen out of the public memory. The second book was only in an edition of 5,000. It also had sold out. It was a much, much smaller volume, but we decided that we wanted to, see them together as a kind of a set. We also checked because we were astonished that these books had never come out in English. We checked very carefully. We looked through all of our bibliographic references. Wilfred Burchett's books on the Portuguese Revolution never appeared in English. However, the first book, the red cover book, within a year, it had been published in Spanish, in a Mexican edition. It had been published in Italian. It had been published in Norwegian, and it had been published in Japanese. And we were so taken by this that we wanted to find out more about who this guy was and why was his work available all over the world in so many different languages, but not in English. So we dug into Wilfred Burchett's past, and we found out that, much to our surprise and very happy to find this out, in the middle of the 20th century, he was one of the world's best-known journalists. He was, but not so much in the English-speaking world. Originally from Australia, but he had been called one of the top and most important journalists of the 20th century. He had published over 32 books. He had written about every conflict in the Cold War. He had published numerous accounts of social revolutions and many of the major military confrontations of the second half of the 20th century. And he covered pretty much every war and revolution in the developing world and the third world from the Second World War until the 1980s. So he's a really fascinating guy. The filmmaker from Australia, John Pilger, says Wilfred Burchett was extraordinary. He cared deeply about people and never tired of defending them against rapacious power. He was also a superb reporter, simply the best. Another extraordinary endorsement came from none other than Studs Terkel. Studs Terkel interviewed him on the 24th of October, 1977, and he said in his introduction, and you can find this online, you can hear the interview with Studs Terkel, and he says, "There are two journalists living today who are rock-like in their integrity and in their courage. One is Wilfred Burchett, the Australian journalist you might say is a universal journalist. He's been everywhere, and often every side calls upon him because he is right there with his information that others lack, because the information is from his own experience and being there." Well, you might ask yourself, where has Wilfred Burchett been? Well, he gains his fame first because he's the first journalist on the ground in Hiroshima. He's the first Western journalist to come to the bomb site of the first atomic weapon. He evades U.S. military, a cordon that the U.S. military had established around Hiroshima. Everyone else is on, all the other journalists are on the USS Missouri watching the signing of the armistice with Japan, but he evaded U.S. security and went to Hiroshima alone. And what he found there shocked him. it was a month after the bombing. The bombing happened on 6th of August, 1945. He was there in September, the 4th of September, I think. And what he finds is people still dying a month after the event. And he wrote a story about it, again, needing to avoid censorship and avoid US military clampdown on news coming out of Hiroshima, but he manages to file a story which went on front pages all over the world. He called it the atomic plague. They didn't know what radiation sickness was yet. He filed the story under the name of his brother, Peter Burchett, and that was one of the ways that he avoided censorship. But all over the world, newspapers picked up this story, and he breaks the news about atomic radiation as part of the nuclear weapons. So he doesn't make any friends in the United States or among the Allies because of his activist reporting from the position of common people. He's very much a leftist historian and journalist. So we wanted to know more about him. Well, he was born in 1911. He comes of age politically during the Great Depression. He was always an advocate of sort of classic 1930s socialism in the vein of Eric Blair, whose name is, yes, you know his name. He wrote Homage to Catalonia. Why am I spacing out on this? George Orwell, thank you. I know his actual name, not his pen name. So he's very much in that avenue of writing. And as a journalist, he's very, very well informed. People from all across the journalistic spectrum consult him about his information because he's often working behind the scenes, getting stories that other people don't get. Wilfred Burchett is in this picture. He's in North Korea in 1951, and he's reporting on the situation in North Korea. He had also covered China during the period of the Chinese Communist Revolution in the 1940s, and he's writing books about all of these experiences that he's having as a journalist. So here's a couple of his books. In 1952, he published a book about China called China's Feet Unbound, in which he saw that, or predicted that China would emerge as a great political and economic power. He writes a book about the Korean War, in which he points to the United States as having tried to undermine the peace process and having used chemical weapons militarily against the North Koreans, and he writes books about this. And of course, this is not winning him any friends or any allies amongst the power structure of the West. Plain perfidy is, he's not mincing words here. He also becomes one of the only journalists to embed with North Vietnamese troops during the Vietnam War. He spends a lot of time with the Viet Cong, months traveling with them, living under the conditions that they lived under. He was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he was well respected by journalists, again, across the board, because he was getting stories that other people didn't get. And while he was writing from the perspective of the enemies of the West, he gained a reputation as an even-handed, fair-minded journalist who was only reporting facts that he saw. So he's not making stuff up, but he's definitely reporting them from a perspective that is from the left. He manages to make relationships with very powerful people. He had access to Ho Chi Minh. This is Wilfred Burchett with Ho Chi Minh and Pham Van Dong, the Vietnamese general. And the woman in the picture is Wilfred Burchett's wife, who was also there, Vesa, and they had enjoyed multiple interviews, breakfasts with Ho Chi Minh. In 1968, he writes a book called Vietnam Will Win, and he predicted correctly that the Vietnamese were going to best the war machine of the United States, even though it was heavily, the most powerful military on the planet with extraordinary resources. He predicted correctly that the Vietnamese would win. He also writes a book later in 1977 called Grasshoppers and Elephants about how the Vietnamese overcame the United States military in Vietnam. So as you can well imagine, he was having problems with his home governments because of this. The Australian government tried to strip him of his citizenship. They did not renew his passport when it expired. He traveled for a long time on Vietnamese papers and Chinese papers, can't remember. But so he's traveling internationally, and that restricts what he can actually do. Eventually, he does get his passport back. He's in New York covering the United Nations, and Henry Kissinger arranges for him to come to the White House because Henry Kissinger wants to pick his brain in 1971 about tactics and capabilities and the political program of the North Vietnamese. And so it was sort of kept very secret, but the White House and Western military analysts were reading everything he wrote. They knew exactly what he was doing, and they knew exactly what he was reporting about, and they made this a centerpiece of their military planning because they knew that he had stories and access to information that they couldn't get. So Henry Kissinger, this is a much later cartoon from the early 2000s from an Australian magazine writing about Wilfred Burchett, but he's caricaturized here for the breakfast that he had with Henry Kissinger in 1971. Well, fast forward to the spring of 1974, April, when Henry Kissinger is very concerned about what's going on in Vietnam, but Wilfred Burchett is in Paris. Burchett spoke fluent French, and from his time being in Vietnam and from his time living in Paris, he spoke French very well. And he's there, he hears that there has been a military coup d'etat in Lisbon, Portugal. And Portugal, of course, at the time has the oldest surviving right-wing dictatorship in Europe. So, being the news hound that he is, he says, I've got to get to where the action is, and he hops on the first plane from Orly Airport down to Lisbon as soon as the Lisbon airport reopened. He doesn't witness the first days of the revolution, but he arrives in Lisbon just a few days later, and he's there for the extraordinary outpouring of democratic feeling on the 1st of May. Now, he doesn't see these events. These are some extraordinary photographs. And I just want to pause to say that for Daniela and I, one of the great pleasures of doing this project was looking at the photographic record of the Portuguese Revolution. And we actually got to meet and work with some of the photographers who were on the ground when this was happening. Now, we didn't actually get to meet the guy who took this photograph. He passed away just after our book was published. But we talked to friends of his, and we actually got to meet a couple of the other photographers who were there. He doesn't see these extraordinary scenes of Caetano being taken into custody by the armed forces movement and being exiled out of the country, but he does arrive shortly thereafter. This is what he sees when he gets to Lisbon. He is staying at the Tivoli Hotel, which was a center for journalists in Lisbon right after the revolution. It's on Avenida de Liberdade. It's right in the center of Lisbon on one of the most beautiful avenues of the city. And he has to cash a traveler's check. And so he goes to the bank, and he's getting ready to cash the money, and the clerk looks at his signature and looks at the name on the traveler's check, and he asks if he's the author, Wilfred Burchett. And he says, well, yeah, I am. And so he calls over a manager from the bank, and it turns out that the manager is also, he has a second job as manager of a press in Lisbon called Sierra Nova Press. And what Wilfred Burchett didn't know is that those books that he had been writing about the Viet Cong were being translated into Portuguese and being assigned as reading to officers in training in the Portuguese military academies, because they are fighting, at the same time the United States is fighting in Vietnam, the Portuguese are fighting 3 colonial wars in Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, and in Mozambique. And the Portuguese military high command thought that it would make sense for their young officers to read about insurgencies and to read about asymmetrical warfare and to read about how small, undersupplied armies were actually defeating the most well-supplied military in the world, the United States. The books had the opposite effect, though. It was convincing the young officer class that they weren't going to win in Angola and in Mozambique and in Guinea-Bissau. And so Burchett is accepted with open arms in Lisbon by the members of the MLA, the MFA, the Movimento de Forças Armadas, the Armed Forces Movement, because they had been reading his books in the military academies in the lead up to the 25th of April. So this is fascinating. He sees this extraordinary outpouring of democratic feeling. This is the first time that the Portuguese had been able to openly express themselves. So this is May Day, 1974, and the man who took this photo has since become a good friend of ours. His name is Fernando Ricardo. He's been at some of our book launches in Lisbon, and he's just so happy, and we're happy that he donated his photographs to our book. The first books, the ones that Burchett published in Portuguese, didn't have any photos in them. But we, in retrospect, wanted to make sure that non-Portuguese readers who didn't maybe know much about Portugal, that they would have these photographic references to give them images about what was going on in Portugal in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. Well, coming back to our discovery of these books, we find them in this old bookstore. And pretty soon after reading them and finding out about who Burchett was and being fascinated by his story, Daniela and I agreed that we thought these books should be made available for the first time to an English reading audience. And so we decided that because they were historically important records and because they offered insights into the process of the revolution that no one else really had, we thought they should be available for English-speaking scholars. But we were not going to translate them from Portuguese back to English. Wilfred Burchett's voice would have been lost. We wanted his original, actual words, and that meant that we had to find the original manuscripts. How are we going to do that? Well, we went to Sierra Nova, still exists. Their offices, turned out, were just down the street from the house of a good friend of ours. We walked by it multiple times, never knew it was there. But then we went there. They didn't have any files from the 1970s. They had moved their offices multiple times. They didn't have their files from Wilfred Burchett. We went to the families of the translators, the people who had translated them. So Burchett wrote the book in English, but it had to be translated in Portuguese. The translators, who in both cases for these books were really well-known Portuguese literary figures who translated them from English to Portuguese. Their families didn't have the original manuscripts either. We went to the Communist Party headquarters of Portugal. Portugal still has a viable Communist Party. They poll about 10% of the vote historically, even up to the present day, especially in the Alentejo. And we thought, well, maybe they would have them because they had supported Burchett's work in the past. They didn't have them either. In the process of making inquiries about Wilfred Burchett, we found out that his son was still alive. His son, the daughter of Wilfred and Vessa, had been born in Vietnam, and he still lives in Vietnam. His name is George. And George Burchett has an email address. And so we wrote to George in Hanoi and said, "Hi, George, we're doing this project on your dad's book. Do you have any idea where we might find papers pertaining to his time in Portugal?" And George, who looks a lot like his dad, wrote back and said, "Well, when my father passed away in 1983, I managed to have all of his surviving papers turned over to the National Library of Australia in Canberra. And they're probably there, but I don't remember seeing anything about Portugal." Now, he was a teenager, George was, when his father was going and his mother were going off to Portugal to report. Burchett made 7 or 8 trips to Portugal during the time of the Portuguese Revolution. But he said, "I don't know if there's any papers there, but if they're there, they're in Canberra." So we wrote emailed. Neither Daniela nor I could afford the time or the expense to go to Australia to look ourselves, but we managed to link up by email with some very hardworking archivists in the library in Australia, and they worked with us and they wrote us back and they said, right, we have his papers. They are in 55 big boxes and they're not cataloged. We're like, oh, all right. But we organize them chronologically. So do you know which boxes they might be in? So we looked very carefully at the chronology. They had a list, a sort of top line list, and we picked 5 boxes where we thought they might be because of the chronology. They were boxes from the mid-70s. And so we sent that information off and we waited and we waited. And a few weeks later, we got this kind of excited email from Canberra, and they said, we think we found them. And they sent us some images, and sure enough, there were multiple copies of the manuscript in varying stages of refinement. And they sent us 1,000 pages of material. The books are about 300 pages, and what we ended up having was we identified what we thought, and we're quite confident, were the final finished, polished drafts of the book that he would have given to the translators to do. And then we matched them up with the translations, and we, page for page, and it ended up being what we needed. So we had his original manuscripts. That process took about 8 years, 9 years for us to do that. It took a long time. We thought, so we found the books in 2011. We thought, great, by 2014, the 40th anniversary of the revolution, we'll have these books ready. Well, they weren't ready until the 50th anniversary of the revolution. So George was very helpful, and he supported our project. He signed off on letting us publish them in English. And this is what the manuscript, this is the first page of the typewritten manuscript looked like. So we got them as a PDF, and they were typescripts. Then it became my job to turn this into a Microsoft Word document, which took a lot of work, and I had to make corrections and all kinds of things. And as the historian in our team, I did all of the contextual footnotes to make it possible for a modern reader to understand what's going on in the text. But the National Library of Australia was a great partner in helping us to find these manuscripts. These are two of the photographers who contributed most to our book. The one on the left is Fernando Ricardo. This is a picture taken about 12 years ago now. Yeah, something like that, 11 years ago. And on his right is Eduardo Guerreiro, who had passed away just as our book was coming out. But both of them very graciously gave us permission to use their photos in our book. And Fernando is just a wonderful guy, and he's been so helpful for us, and I'm very grateful for his contribution. Many of the photos that you're going to see tonight are from him. The last thing we needed was a photo of the man himself, Wilfred Burchett. And so I wrote back to George, and I said, hey, George, do you have a photo of your dad from the mid-1970s, possibly, you know, in the time when he might have been working on the Portuguese Revolution? And he rummaged around in his papers, and he sent me 2 possibilities, and this was far and away the best one. This is Wilfred Burchett working in his home office in Paris, a suburb of Paris. George provided this great background story. He said, you know, I knew my dad was home when I heard the typewriter very early in the morning or very late at night. And I knew that my father was not off reporting, but he was actually back home with his family and his kids. So this is a picture taken from about the time. I can't swear that he's working on the captain's coup in this picture, but it's simultaneous. It's from the time that he was working. So we thank George very much for the addition of that photograph. Well, at this point, I think I'm going to be quiet and turn you over to the capable hands of Daniela, who's going to tell you about the analysis of Wilfred Burchett and the revolution. Thank you.
Okay, it's always a tough act to follow after Tim, but thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure for us to talk about this book and about the process that led us to this book. As Tim told you, he's the historian, I'm the political scientist, and most of my work has focused primarily on social movement activism in the Portuguese Revolution and in Portuguese democracy, so I was keenly interested. In fact, when we were in Lisbon, I was at the time doing my Fulbright, interviewing feminist organizations that mobilized during the revolution. So this book really helped contextualize a lot of the period for me, because one of the things that I really wanted and sort of brought into my own process of thinking about the revolution, I was born after it. I was born in 81, the revolution happened 74 and 75, and I wanted a ton of books. I tried to collect, and Tim helped me collect a ton of books that sort of gave me a sense of the zeitgeist of the revolution. And man, when I got to the reading of The Captain's Coup, I couldn't put it down, right? And I knew immediately that there was something different about the way that he was telling the story of the Portuguese Revolution. Tim talked about, or referred it as an Orwell sort of style, and it is. If you know Homage to Catalonia, but especially, I think it reminds me even more of Road to Wigan Pier, that sort of invested journalism that definitely has a viewpoint that comes from the left in the context of the Cold War, but it's very engagé, very interested in the common people, in the average person, and how they're experiencing the process as well. It's an incredible storyteller. And you know, as someone who also teaches the Portuguese Revolution in some of my classes at BU, I was always also on the lookout, and have been on the lookout, for books that were factual, but not so academic that students get completely turned off by the storytelling. And this is one of those books. It's written by a journalist for a general public to understand what's happening with this incredible revolution. So that's really what grabbed us early on, and then, as Tim told quite well, we came to find out that he was actually this huge name in the journalism of the Cold War, this huge figure. So let me tell you just a couple of things before I jump into this analysis. And my analysis, I just want to highlight a few points more from from the point of view of his politics and his journalism, and where we can contextualize that, and then what he brings to our knowledge of the Portuguese Revolution. And then I want to read you my favorite passage from the book. and then we can open up for discussion. For those of you who are less familiar with the Portuguese Revolution is a huge event. It's a huge event politically. It's a huge event in Portugal, but it's a huge international event. And it doesn't often get the credit that it needs, in the sense that, you know, we know so much in the United States about the Iranian Revolution. Almost everyone has heard about 1979 and shenanigans, you know, that led to that revolution, and, you know, the breakdown of the relationship between the United States and Iran. But very few people on the street, maybe I think a lot of the people in this room might be an exception to that, but very few people know what happened in Portugal, and how Portugal was really the beginning of a wave of democratization that went all the way around the world, and it affected many countries in Latin America. It really helped change the checkerboard across Europe towards democracy as well. And in many ways, the Portuguese Revolution fits the classical model of revolutionary process. It starts as, you know, we had this other picture here. It starts as a fever, a very famous scholar of revolutions talks about. Like, when you have a revolution, whatever the trigger to the revolution was, revolutions are made by people taking over the streets and basically taking politics into their own hands, and being contaminated by this fervor of change, by this fever, this energy of imagining something that had seemed impossible just days before, right? Imagining a whole new future and being really taken by that energy. But then revolutions get complicated, because what happens is you have one really repressive regime, often, that is overtaken by the revolutionaries, brought down. Everyone works together and supports the bringing down of this regime, but then you have to create a new regime, right? And it's in the creation of a new regime that you start to see the tension and the breaking and the flare-ups, and often the period in the middle of a revolution tends to be quite heated, because often what you have is the creation of a constituent assembly that's going to work on a new constitution. You often will have elections that will lead to that constituent assembly. After that constituent assembly is in power, however, suddenly you have all of these newly forming political parties that have very different visions of the future, right? And those very different visions of the future are going to clash, are going to collide. And people are mobilized on the streets and they're going to start to take sides, right? So the Portuguese Revolution unfolds very much through the stages exactly as every political scientist who studies this process would tell you it would, until the final stage of the process. In the final stage of the process, right, it is often the radicals, the individuals who are most willing to use violence, often armed violence, who tend to win and take over the revolutionary process. You see this in Russia, 1917, right? The storming of the palace. It's a minority. It's the Bolsheviks, who are really a minority faction within the Russian Revolution, who are going to backstab everybody else and take power by force, right? You see this in, the Arab Spring, in the Egyptian Revolution. So recently, many of you can remember this process, right? It went exactly through all the stages until the military steps in and says, no more constituent assembly, right? No more, we're taking the process. They're the radicals in that process. In Portugal, the Portuguese Revolution takes a whole different route, because guess what? It's the moderates that launched the coup against the radicals, okay? And that's going to completely turn the path of the Portuguese Revolution away from the more radical visions towards a communist state, or even there's all sorts of versions that the more radical voices are pushing for, but it's going to be, and when I say the moderates, it's going to be the individuals who are centrists, who are pro-democracy, pro-maintaining Portugal within the West, who are going to really take the radicals and shut them up, put them aside from the process. Many of them were arrested, but nobody was killed. That's something else we can chat later on about. And they're going to basically coordinate and protect the work of the Constituent Assembly up until 1975, and the country transitions to a democracy. So it's very much, sorry for the history lesson, but I'm trying to make it as concise as possible, because revolutionary processes are dense. But that's what Burchett comes into. Burchett, after having spent his entire career covering anti-colonialist movements against colonial empires from the West, after being really the voice, right? One of the only voices to report from the side of North Vietnam, right, during the Vietnam War, after predicting that the United States could not possibly win that conflict, because the United States had, in his view, and I think history proved them right, a misguided understanding of what motivated the Vietnamese to continue their fight. Right? That for the Vietnamese, this was not about communism. This was about their own national identity and the ability to self-determine their lives and their country. He comes with all of this knowledge into the Portuguese Revolution. So what we get is late life Burchett analyzing a revolutionary process that has global implications that will lead to the dismantling of the Portuguese Empire, the last European empire to dismantle. And he's bringing, you can see it throughout his writing. It's everywhere. He sprinkles a lot of this knowledge, a lot of the understanding of the international context into his understanding of the revolution. Now, let me talk about him as a journalist. And this is particularly special to me, because those of you who know me know that I'm also really involved with local journalism in New Bedford. So ever since I became involved with the New Bedford Light Project, I have come to think about Burchett in whole new ways, right? And the types of challenges that and decisions that he made himself as a journalist. He was called many things: a radical journalist, an advocacy journalist, a commie all the time. I mean, all of his detractors referred to him as just, being a communist, pretending to be a journalist and reporting for the other side, and being a traitor to the West for, not taking the positions or not assuming the positions that the West took. He, to the end of his life, and he was pretty open about this, he was often interviewed himself, right, as a source of information, and asked whether or not he was indeed a communist. He said no, he was not a communist, but he definitely, he needs to be understood within, like the Portuguese Revolution, within the context of the 1970s, within the context of what's happening around the world, and the fact that he did take a side early on. And he was really clear about his side. This was not hidden, by the way. So as you read him, he certainly is coming at this with great enthusiasm. When he arrives in Portugal and he sees what's happening, and he realizes that it's mid-rank officers in the Portuguese military that launch a coup against the regime. So it's a coup within a coup, because the coup is a coup within the military structure, right? They're going against their own generals, right? And then they're launching a coup against the regime and bringing down the regime, and then are presenting the country with a platform of democracy, decolonization, and development, right? He immediately sensed there was something really different and really special. This is the 70s. Military coups normally did not lead to democratic outcomes. Think about Latin America in the 1970s and all the military coups that carried. So he could tell there was something different, there was something unusual, and the more he became embedded with the revolution, the more he interviewed people and went around the country, the more he realized and was, I would say, pretty infected by the fever of the revolution during the first year, but with a clinical and analytical eye to what was happening as well. Let me just say this. Yes, the final point that I want to make, I already made it, but in terms of political theory, this book doesn't add much to theorizing about revolutions and whatnot. But guess what? Most people don't read books because of the political theory, right? That's for academics here. What this book does bring, and that has academic value and I think public value to everybody, is the book itself is a document, and a historical document. It's not just the vision of Burchett and his own experience and the richness of his analysis. Is that the type of interviews that he did are incredible, nowhere to be found. Not the interviews with the leaders of the revolution, with those officers, that were carrying the process, but especially the interviews with just average people, with the fishermen, with the peasants, with the farmers. That's where you really feel the pulse of the revolution. Not just those who were excited about it, but those who were absolutely terrified throughout the process that the country would become communist, or that change was coming too fast. So, and one of the passages, the passage I picked to read to you, I think highlights that quite well. I love this picture because this guy, look at his commitment. I mean, he copied and pasted the hammer and sickle into his shirt for May 1st of 1974, and to go on that parade. It really tells you about the zeitgeist. So for many of you, you may not recognize his names, but they were absolutely some of the most important names in the transitional government and the armed forces movement that led the revolution. He interviews people like Ernesto Melo, who, as our note shows here, was one of the authors of the political program of the entire movement that brought down the revolution. Here's an excerpt from an interview that he did with Burchett, confirming what Tim was talking about. The fact that, Burchett was so well known and so well read, that all of the officers were aware of who he was. And he said it was a great shock for the young Portuguese officers to note that it was impossible for the United States, despite fantastic military technology, to defeat the people of a small, underdeveloped country. The lessons of the Vietnamese struggle described in your books play the most important role in the political development of the younger officers. There were factors which even right-wing officers could not ignore. He then goes on to interview, I just have a number of images here for you. He interviewed 2 out of 3 of the elements here. This is a very famous cover of Time magazine in the summer of 1975, during that hot period of tension in which the world was looking at Portugal and thinking, oh, they're going communist and there's going to be a civil war. So he had close contact with his leaders and interviewed them. This is Álvaro Cunhal, who was the leader of the Portuguese Communist Party, also interviewed by him. Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, who was here a few years ago, a decade ago, before he passed. António Rosa Coutinho, representative certainly of a more radical left, like to the left of the Portuguese Communist Party. Like the Portuguese Revolution had many gradations to the left. José Manuel Tengarrinha, these are all very Portuguese people immediately recognized as individuals and as names, but we know that the general population reading our book nowadays would not, and that's why Tim took such great care in annotating every single name in this book. And then he also interviewed Ramalho, who would eventually become, president of Portugal, and Vasco Lourenço. I mean, we're talking about top figures, but it's, again, to me, when he gets to the workers, to the fishermen, to the peasants, to the women, that to the average people on the street, that his vision becomes alive and tells us really what no other book of the Portuguese Revolution tells us. So I want to read you a passage. Thank you for your patience. I realize I've been talking now for 19 minutes. I had planned on 15. This is a passage from him in Trás-os-Montes. Trás-os-Montes is a northern interior region in Portugal, in mainland Portugal. And trust me, not many journalists got to Trás-os-Montes during the Portuguese Revolution. And I want to give you a flavor and a sense for how he's reporting this as well, not just what he's reporting. He says, he starts by giving a general introduction to the region. He says, the Trás-os-Montes covers some 10,000 square kilometers with a population of a little over 400,000. Proportionately, it is the area which provides the greatest number of emigrants. Per capita production is the lowest in the country, 76% of the population being engaged in agriculture, being mainly for their own consumption. At the headquarters of the democratic movement in Mirandela, in the very heart of Trás-os-Montes, João Vicente, a specialist on the economic social situation in the region, explained some of the reasons that pushed people into emigration. The first step is always Lisbon or Porto in search of work or a better life. In Lisbon, there is 1 doctor for every 400 inhabitants. In the Trás-os-Montes, 1 for every 3,000. In Lisbon, 90% of houses have bathrooms and kitchens. 70% have running water. Here, the proportion is less than 10% for bathrooms, kitchens, and running water. By the way, this is 1975. Okay? Less than 10% of houses with electricity, bathrooms, or running water. In Lisbon, the average per capita consumption of electricity is 800 kilowatts. Here, it is 60 kilowatts. Most of the tiny farms are split up into 6 or more parcels of land impossible to cultivate by modern methods, even if credit were available to buy draught animals and implements. Around Mirandela, 80 to 90% of people are illiterate. 80 to 90%, okay? Even those who know the alphabet cannot usually read. Farming methods are 2 to 3 centuries behind the times. Because of emigration, 80% of those who work in the fields are old people and children. There are no markets for what people produce, And where there are markets, there is no transport to get the produce to them. So I want to pause here to say, I mean, I'm from northern Portugal. I grew up in the 80s in a country that was transitioning from this, right, into what Portugal is nowadays. And I mean, the transition was tremendous. It was incredible, fantastic, really. But I grew up in between these worlds. Like, my grandparents were all farmers. They were peasants, really. My grandparents, 3 out of 4, were completely illiterate. People only wore shoes to go to church or to the doctor, you know, otherwise the peasants across the north were going about their lives and their work without any shoes every day. And I mean, that's the sort of stuff that he captures, and that has become so important for the national discussion, even in Portugal right now, because some of you may be aware that the far right is also making a lot of headway in Portuguese politics. And one of their arguments, and in fact, the candidate of the far right party, Chega in Portugal, just gave an interview a few days ago saying that what Portugal needs to be on the straight and narrow is 3 Salazars. So this is a direct quote from an actual interview given by this individual to TV. So as you can see, this is very much on the national conversation, where we were, how we truly were, right, and how far we've come in 5 decades. So now my favorite part, I promise, and then I'll be done, and you can ask me, us, any questions that you want. So, with José Francisco Nereu as guide, friend, and reserve driver, we toured the Trás-os-Montes area for 10 days. One of our early stops was at the small, somnolent town of Lusophone, on the road from Mirandela to Montalegre, far from the ordinary tourist routes. Still very far, it's a tiny place. A small boy guided us to what he insisted was the only functioning restaurant. It was, in fact, the living room of 2 black-gowned elderly spinsters, Candida and Clotilde, my favorite characters in the whole book. Okay. José quickly established that they could provide us with a meal. At the single dining table were 2 men, one solidly built and ruddy-faced with sleeves rolled up to the elbow and mobile oil stamped across his red shirt, the other, slighter and smaller, also in his shirt sleeves. They introduced themselves as Macedo and Sebastião, respectively. Macedo asked if we were French, as that was the common language of our group. And when we replied that we were Bulgarian, that was his wife, Bulgarian and Australian, respectively, he roared and slapped his thighs, "Clotilde, Candida, quick, hide in the kitchen! PCP, PCP, there's a real live communist arrived! The sort your priest tells you eats babies for breakfast." To us, he explained, "I'm the imperialist agent of Mobil Oil at Mirandela, and Sebastião drives the petrol truck outside." The 2 were obviously frequent visitors and on good terms with the sisters, one of whom came in holding a panting fawn and white rabbit by its ears for our inspection. As in some fish restaurants, a flapping trout is brought in for approval before it goes into the frying pan. "Bulgaria, I've read about it," continued Macedo. "It was under the heel of fascists like ours 25 years ago or so. It was the country of Dimitrov. I read all about the Leipzig trial. Go on." With a broad wink to us, he said to Clotilde, "Run, run and tell your priest that the communists have come to take over." Turning to us, he said, "They are typical fruits of fascism, this too, priest-ridden as you can find." He apparently added, something to which José Francisco deemed better not to translate, because Clotilde, who was preparing our end of the table, reddened and said solemnly, "Our priest has been here for 35 years. He's a good man, never chases after women, and he has never talked about communists eating babies for breakfast. He's only interested in church affairs." We asked Clotilde what she thought about the changes since the 25th of April. By her stammering reaction, it was obvious that she was not used to having her opinion asked about anything. "Tell them what the priest told you last Sunday," roared Macedo. After a pause, she said, "All we hope is that things won't change too quickly." We asked if she thought that ending the wars in Africa would be a good thing. Candida, who arrived from the kitchen at that moment, said, It would be good if our man didn't get killed anymore, but... And she hastened back into the kitchen, red-faced. José explained later that she probably thought that she had uttered a heresy by suggesting that anything good could come from such a regime. My wife gave birth on 26 April, said Macedo, and when the priest came for the christening, I said, good that he was born on this day. He'll grow up under democracy. The priest replied, this godless regime won't last long. That's what they're like, those priests. We do have a few more images, and the book has just come out in Portuguese in Portugal. In fact, we'll be going out in November to Lisbon in order to promote the Portuguese version of our book. I do want to say that just on the note of this passage, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do, there's so much that he captures there. The role of women in Portuguese society, the two spinster sisters who are not used to giving their opinion, who survive by basically using their living room for meals for the locals. The relationship of the church with the population, especially up north. The skepticism of the Catholic Church about the revolution, right? And especially the social changes that were coming along with the revolution. The entire language of the period and the fact that the guy working for Mobil Oil meant that he was an imperialist because he was working, for Mobil Oil. I mean, there's so much in such a small episode. But if you actually stop to think about it, it's telling us quite a lot about the social relationships and the fears and hopes, right, of the Portuguese people during this time. So it's incredibly rich like this, and that's really what compelled us to the book, and we hope it will compel you too if you're curious to learn more about the revolution. So thank you.
I started to say this and then I got sidetracked. Burchett spoke fluent French, and so he was able to speak with many of the officers and the politicians in Portugal in French, and that was their language of communication. But with common people who didn't know French, he used interpreters, and in this case you saw they were speaking French around the table, but he was using interpreters. So he's making notes, and many of the interviews, it's clear that he had recorded them, and some of the interviews were put into the original Portuguese version, verbatim, and then we had to translate those from part of the text as well. We went back to make sure that they were faithful to the original Portuguese. So I'm just going to put this up there. I wanted to go back really quickly, something Daniela passed by very fast. I wanted to show you this image, because it's so important for the revolution. There it is. There were propaganda posters produced by the armed forces movement, and one of the things that really impressed Burchett was this connection between common people and the soldiers. And the MFA made a lot of capital on the fact that they were really seen as agents of popular democracy, because they had thrown over the dictatorship, and instead of moving the country to the right as a right-wing military coup, as one might expect, instead they were all about embracing and introducing a democratic process. So Burchett was really fundamentally taken by that. Good. Okay, so we'll be happy to answer questions.
Yes, please wait for the microphone to reach you.
You mentioned that some of the Portuguese were concerned that this was going to result in some kind of communist takeover, and you can betcha that probably the Americans were thinking much the same. Was there an attempt at intervention in this, even of the clandestine kind?
Why don't you go ahead and answer it?
Can you? Yes. Okay, good. What a great question.
That guy must be a historian.
Yes. So, The communists in Portugal and much of the radical left, the Maoists and every other faction that, you could imagine existed in Portugal during this period, they were completely convinced that the CIA was, preparing a coup. And they were also convinced, and this will be of interest for our population here, that the CIA was going to help the Azores become independent, because the Azores were so strategically important, and there was this independence movement, and this independence movement was also mobilizing quite heavily right here out of Fall River and New Bedford, Massachusetts. So there was a lot of fear that the CIA would intervene, but there is nothing in the historical record, and much of it is now available to the public that shows any type of CIA intervention. Of course, it didn't help that Carlucci, who was ambassador to Portugal in '75, then went on to become the number 2 at the CIA under the Reagan administration. It certainly gave even more fodder to, the idea that he was actually always a CIA covert operator for the Kissinger and not Nixon, Ford administration. But no, the Americans were deeply involved. Kissinger thought that Portugal was just going to be Russia 1917 playing all over.
Cuba in Europe is what he was worried about.
A very famous line from him when he met the man who would become prime minister in Portugal and was also president, Mário Soares. The name may be familiar to some of you. Soares is considered the father of Portuguese democracy almost, a really important voice, and he had a role in the provisional government as the head of foreign affairs. And he met Kissinger, and there's this really famous interaction between them in which Kissinger says, how does he start? You're a Kerensky. That's how he starts. You're a Kerensky. I mean, this is Kissinger to, if you know Kerensky, Kerensky was the moderate prime minister that got, completely sideswiped by the Bolsheviks. And he says, you're a Kerensky. Basically, you're a guy who can't see what's coming, and these radicals are going to, take over and steamroll you. And Soares replied, I don't want to be a Kerensky. And Kissinger apparently quipped back, neither did Kerensky. Right? And I love this, because he was so wrong. Kissinger was actually so wrong in his reading of what's happening on the ground in the Portuguese Revolution. So he's convinced that, the radicals are actually going to take over, Portugal's going to go communist, and he already has a whole plan about how to isolate Portugal, kick it out of NATO, isolate it from the rest of Europe, and use it as, use it as an example of what other Southern Europeans shouldn't do by allowing the communists to participate in government whatsoever. So the Americans are very attentive, they're very concerned, but they're not intervening in the way that they did in Chile and many other spots where we do know, in fact, that they were, doing covert operations.
U.S. Ambassador to Portugal, Carlucci, was pretty convinced that the Portuguese Revolution was going to moderate and not go far to the left. But he had a hard time convincing his boss, Kissinger, about that. But he had this remarkable way of getting access to the president.
That access was the chief of staff, Donald Rumsfeld, who had been roommates with Mr. Carlucci at Princeton. So there's this incredible juncture in the Portuguese Revolution in which Kissinger is trying to stop the executive office and the Congress from giving any aid packages to Portugal because he thinks this is a lost situation in the summer of '75. And Carlucci gets on a plane without being called to Washington, comes to Washington, goes to Kissinger, and basically says, your reading is wrong, and I'm going to talk to the president. I have a meeting scheduled with the president to talk about this. And Kissinger says, okay, go have your meeting. Of course, he had this meeting because the chief of staff had given him a meeting. So he has all of these back channels that he's probably the only man in the State Department at that time that could do this to Kissinger. So Portugal's incredibly lucky in many ways that Carlucci was there and that he was so proactive and willing to go head-to-head with Kissinger. And then Kissinger basically ends up calling him again into the office to say, okay, let's have a talk. And actually, Carlucci ends up never meeting with Ford and just coming back with Portugal with the agreement that Kissinger was now going to follow his recommendations. So, sorry, I know too much background information on all this. I don't want to give you an earful. I saw there are other questions. This was a very long response to your question, Len.
Hi, I have two quick questions. The first one is with regards to the manuscript, the English manuscript. If you didn't have access or weren't able to find that original manuscript, would you have gone forward with the project?
Probably not.
Yeah, probably not. We felt very strongly that Burchett's true original voice should be heard, and we were very reticent to attempt a reverse engineering of the text from Portuguese into English, because there would have been too much guesswork. We wouldn't have known what words, we would have entirely lost the flavor of the exchange that Daniela read. And so I really think that we never really gave up, but it took us so long to finally get to the point where we had access to the originals that when we finally did realize that there was a chance they were going to be there in Australia, and then we found them, that made it all really happen. But I don't think, if that had been a dead end, I don't think we would have pursued it.
Of course, we weren't working on this full time we were going on with our many other projects, but every single time we had a trip planned to Lisbon, we made sure we took a day aside to go investigate some new avenue of where this might be. It was a fun little detective side project.
We fired up all our connections in Portugal. We had Rui Zink, a good friend of ours who's a well-known writer in Portugal. He was talking to people that he knew, and we tried everything, and we just couldn't find these manuscripts until someone put us in contact with Burchett's son, and then it began to work out.
I guess perseverance pays off. My other question is, are there any major unresolved issues from the revolution that, no, I'm sorry. Is there a single major unresolved issue that you'd like to tell us about?
I alluded to it during my presentation. The 25th of November, which is the date in which there's a clash between the moderate factions of the armed forces movement and, let's say, the more radical factions or more to the left factions of the movement. And, the moderates basically claimed that there was an attempt, that there was going to be a coup coming from the left. The left claimed that such a coup was a complete invention and an excuse, to basically quiet down the voices of officers who had a different vision for Portugal. The historic record is not particularly clear on who is correct. There's still a lot that remains unknown in the historical record about how things truly unfolded and what each individual knew. And the far-right party that has emerged as the second largest party in parliament right now is this new party called Chega, which means enough, has basically instrumentalized the history of that critical juncture in the Portuguese Revolution, the 25th of November of 1975, and turned it into, they claim, the most important, the date that truly brought us democracy. And it's a bit of a subversion, and I'll tell you why I think that's a subversion. Of course, it's a very important date, because as I highlighted, it's the date in which the moderate forces prevailed over the more radical voices, and that's really what ensured that the Portuguese democratic process could continue. At the same time, it was only possible for that moment to exist, let's just say, for that moment to not become a civil war, right? Because of the cool heads of so many of these figures that are now being villainized by the Portuguese new right. So let me give you an example. Álvaro Cunhal, the leader of the PCP, he was called the Portuguese Communist Party. He agreed, he was told that, a few hours ahead that this was going to happen. He was called in for, basically a frank conversation about we don't want to spill the blood of Portuguese people and certainly of other soldiers that helped us, carry this revolution on the streets. You have to be a voice for moderation, and you cannot tell the communists to come to the streets and to fight us on this. And he doesn't, right? I mean, this is a conversation between Melo and Cunhal, which is pretty much on the record. Hotel Saraiva de Carvalho, who was another, the Portuguese Castro, if you want, right? A very radical left. He himself, right, also agrees, he's called in by President Costa Gomes, and he agrees to not mobilize his factions into the streets. So here we actually have, the story is really complex, but it's a story of people who had fought together for over a decade in wars, who now found themselves in different ideological camps, but were still unwilling to kill each other and to kill Portuguese people on the streets. And that's the legacy of the 25th of November that, in my opinion, we should be talking more about when we discuss how Portugal got to democracy. But it has truly been politicized and instrumentalized by this new right, who are now demanding, for instance, that this should be the date that we celebrate instead of the 25th of April. So sorry for the long...
That's okay. We are out of time for any questions, but I want to, yes, it's almost.
Can I just say quickly,
Sure.
there were so many moments where the Portuguese Revolution was on a knife edge, where it could have gone extremely violently and very badly. The picture I just put up shows tanks that supported the dictatorship in the background and tanks of the MFA in the foreground, and they were facing off on Lisbon's waterfront on the morning of the 25th of April. And the fact that they didn't fire on one another was a minor miracle, and it would have resulted in huge destruction in Lisbon if it had come to blows. So, the Portuguese Revolution is remarkable in a lot of ways, but the fact that they didn't actually kill each other. Can we allow John Bullard the question, please?
You have your hand?
Oh, just one quick, yes. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Tim and Daniela. This has been really amazing. It's too bad there's no connection to present-day activities from what you're talking about. But
I can't imagine what that might be.
When I was mayor, we hosted in the city of New Bedford President Suarez. Had a big dinner for him at vocational school, and he was very well received, and it was a proud day for the city of New Bedford. My question is kind of linked to this photograph, and that is militaries, as I understand it, are not democracies. It's top down, do what I say. And so I'm interested, as I understand it, the military intimidated Caetano into resigning. How did the military, my question is, was it top down or was it bottom up? And how did the military communicate with each other, knowing that anyone could out you if you were thinking about what happened?
The thing about the captain's coup is that it's not from the top down, it's from the middle down. So it's mid-level officers. The most senior person in the armed forces movement was, I think, a major, or maybe a colonel, I'm not, but most of them were captains. And many of the rank-and-file soldiers that were sort of gathered up and ordered to go to Lisbon to overthrow the regime on the morning of the foot soldiers, they were pretty inexperienced recruits. They hadn't been deployed to Africa yet. Their officers had been, but what we learned when Otella Saraiva came to visit us was that many of the troops that he relied on were pretty green soldiers. They were not. So how did they communicate? They did it in secrecy. This is, before internet. They are speaking person to person. They are doing it away from cities, away from ears. This is a period of time where, under the Estado Novo, the regime of the right-wing dictatorship, you weren't supposed to gather in groups to have conversations, but the army could do it, and so they managed to do it largely without being overheard. The regime knew that what they were doing. The armed forces movement was not a secret to the upper levels of the regime. But
Also because they had some failed attempts.
Precisely, but they didn't know really how to stop it, and so a regime kind of allowed it to happen.
Just a very quick note to add to what Tim said. It's really important for the way that the dynamic of the revolution unfolded, especially during the hot summer of '75, in which tensions were really flaring. I think it was really important that it was the captains and mostly foot soldiers and not the top echelons of the military that were involved in this. Why? Because these captains were the people on the ground with those soldiers at war. Okay, they were the ones that had the loyalty of those soldiers. And that loyalty plays over and over and over again at every single critical juncture in which violence could have erupted. And I think, again, there's a less emphasized part of how the revolution unfolded, but it's a really important story. Part of the story for the Portuguese is that the armed forces movement and the solidarity amongst them is really forged by this common experience of war and not wanting to bring that home.
And I really think we should leave it there. So thank you for the extra time. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for joining our Lusophone lecture series, and there is going to be books that you can buy, as well as some signing. And thank you very much for an informative and entertaining evening, Daniela and Timothy.